This is part 2 of our series on the confession tape. Check out part 1 for the beginning. Trigger warning for this episode, we discuss suicidal ideation and we mention child emotional, physical, and sexual abuse.
One of the reasons why I find the tape so interesting is because it does confirm some things. Like, there are some hidden truths within the tape, and certain statements that are made on the tape which are consistent with testimony or corroborate certain testimony. Within the tape, there's 2 different sections where Oziel refers to a disinheriting of the brothers, or a possible disinheriting of the brothers, and these 2 sections, I would say, corroborate the brothers' testimony that they were under the assumption that they had been disinherited at the time of the killings.
And there's a lot of stuff that your dad was doing, including talking about disinheriting you, or actually having said they did disinherit you, I guess, at a couple of points. But I didn't enter into it too much, because I felt like Erik and I could handle it.
So it's like, okay, there, he's literally saying, like, the disinheritance did not affect our decision to do this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few references to, like, both, like, the disinheritance and also that the killings weren't done for money. That, like, to me, confirms that there was no money motivation at all. Even though that's something that still to this day lingers in people's minds about this case. Like, that people treat this tape like this smoking gun piece of evidence, and in this tape, it's clear that they did not commit this for money.
Yeah. That's something that I find very interesting, is just the fact that people like pick and choose certain things from this tape and will just ignore the rest of it. And I feel like this is another good example, because these sections are contradictory to part of the prosecution's theory, right? So, like, it corroborates not only what the brothers testified to, but also what their Uncle Carlos testified to, right? Which is that he had a conversation with Jose where Jose had told him that he had told the brothers that they had already been disinherited. I think that conversation took place, I want to say, like, early summer, which would have been at least a couple months before the killings. So, if the brothers were under the assumption that they were disinherited, why would they kill for money?
Right, because, like, if they were disinherited and their parents were killed, then they wouldn't inherit.
It makes no logical sense, right? So, but then it's also supportive of the testimony of their aunt, Marta Cano, because she testified to having, like, a meeting with the brothers where she was supposed to discuss the inheritance, right? And, like, what the brothers would be inheriting. And she basically said that the brothers kept saying to her, like, look, Marta, like, we're not inheriting anything. Like, Dad said that he had disinherited us. And then she kept saying to them, like, no, like, that didn't happen. And they were very confused. So then, like, if I'm playing devil's advocate, right, you'd say, from a prosecution side, you'd say, oh, well, the brothers were basically pretending to be confused because they didn't want to, like, let on to the fact that, like, they killed for money, right? But seeing as we have corroboration from multiple sources that the brothers were under the assumption that they wouldn't be inheriting at the time, it's pretty clear that, like, their reactions to Marta during that conversation were genuine. Like, they genuinely were like, we're not getting any money. Like, we're not supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else about it that stood out to you?
Well, I think, like, the fact that Oziel brought this up, and, like, the fact that he knew that Jose had talked about disinheriting them, like, shows that Erik probably told him that before, like, told him that in... Or no, wait. Never mind. There's a line later that Kitty had told him, right?
I was there. I remember when your mom called me and told me that your dad was disinheriting you because he didn't like how you were behaving in the table. He thought you weren't being respectful enough. But he couldn't tell you because he never talked about feelings, and he wouldn't talk about feelings. And, I remember telling you that, and you didn't even look that surprised. That must have been what your dad was like to me.
So that kind of shows you that Oziel has knowledge of this from Kitty, right?
Yeah, and, well, first of all, like, Oziel is the one that keeps bringing up this topic of disinheritance, but also, like, the fact that he has this prior knowledge and, like, that it came from Kitty shows that this issue of disinheritance was, like, brought up when the parents were still alive. And then later in that section where Oziel says that Kitty told him about the disinheritance, he says, "I remember telling you that and you didn't even look that surprised." So it's like, this topic of disinheritance has come up before in Oziel and Erik's sessions, right? There's no way to know if it got brought up before the parents were killed or not, but the fact that Oziel himself says, "You didn't even look that surprised when I told you that your dad had disinherited you." I don't know, to me that shows that that wasn't something that they would have killed over, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't so shocked by it or, like, mad about it that they were going to do anything about it, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, it's also like, why kill for money that you think you're not inheriting anyway, right? You could argue that they were told they were disinherited, so then they chose to kill out of anger, even knowing that they wouldn't get anything anyway, or thinking that they wouldn't get anything. But it still doesn't really make much sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know what he says afterwards? Erik says,
"I look back on where I'm now with my parents, and I wish it would have been so much more different. I look back and I wish that my brother and I would have had an extremely close relationship, and I would tell her everything that happened over. I would tell her everything. And all my relationships with different people and everything. She wanted to know, and I was raised that I couldn't tell her."
what were your thoughts on that section?
I mean, I think that, especially the line where he says, like, "I would tell her everything about all my relationships with different people," like, that to me is, like, him referencing the sexual abuse and that he wishes he had, like, told Kitty about it before. I think we've talked about how, like, Erik was always closer to Kitty and Lyle was always closer to Jose. So, like, to me, this is Erik kind of reflecting on that and wishing that he had, like, actually opened up to his mom about, like, what was happening to him.
Mm-hmm. That section, isn't that section where, like, Kuriyama uses it and then tries to spin it as, like, he's actually talking about, like, how he wishes, like, he told his mom about his relationships with men?
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah. I don't know. I just don't think that theory makes any sense. I mean, I think that whole section, like, shows a lot about generally what the family was like. Like, he says, like, regardless of what he's talking about, he says, like, all my relationships with different people and everything she wanted to know, and I was raised that I couldn't tell her.
Yeah. Generally, it fits into what the defense was saying about the brothers being raised in a family of secrets and having parents who weren't actually available to them emotionally, right? Regardless of what Erik is referring to here, it could be about Jose, it could be about any, like, his relationships with girlfriends, relationships with other people, who knows, I don't know. But yeah, like, that fits in, right?
Yeah. Something that I found super interesting when I was first listening to this tape was that, like we've been talking about, the main theory on this tape is, like, Kitty's suicidality and discovering the affair, like, in 1987, that's the reason that they killed their parents, which, like we've discussed, doesn't really make sense. But the situations that the brothers talk about that, like, relate to that time period were things that they testified about. And the majority of the beginning of the tape is them, like, discussing this time when they found the suicide note, or Erik found the suicide note, and then he called Lyle and was hysterical and, like, needing Lyle to help him, like, with their mother, and then Kitty rejected Lyle's help. But when I was first listening to this, I listened to it after I listened to the brothers' testimony, and I was like, oh yeah, they, like, testified about all of these things, and what they said in their testimony is exactly what they said on this tape about, like, this time period, including, like, some of the parts of that were very, I think, like, very manipulative and emotionally abusive of Kitty to do, like leaving the suicide note, rejecting Lyle's help. Those were some examples of just her, I don't know how else to say it, but like her failure as a mother.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's her rejection of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that she would always side with Jose.
Right, yeah.
It's very indicative of that. But then all this comes from 3 years before, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, like, I still don't think it makes any sense that that was the motivation for them killing their parents, but I always found it interesting that, like, you know, there was so much debate about if the brother's testimony was true. This whole section is true both from the brother's testimony and from what they say on this tape.
Yeah.
And there are many references in this tape that are consistent with what the brothers testified about. The main one that keeps coming up is Lyle constantly refers to killing Jose as getting rid of a problem.
It was a big thing holding us back from killing my father, is that we thought that we would just kill Dad and eliminate the problem.
Like, Lyle constantly referring to Jose as, like, the problem. He said that killing him was important and necessary, and that killing Jose was, like, getting rid of the source. Which, if you want to analyze this from a prosecution perspective of, like, the theory on this tape of why they killed their parents is true, then the reason that Jose is a problem is because he's, like, a controlling guy and he treats their mom terribly.
Mm-hmm. If they're killing Jose partly because he's incredibly abusive and controlling, even towards Kitty, and that's part of the reason why she was suicidal or miserable, killing only Jose would solve the issue then. And solve the issue for Kitty too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, okay, well then why did they kill Kitty if they were killing Jose because he was abusive towards Kitty? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. The theory that they give for why Kitty was killed doesn't make sense with the theory they gave for why Jose was killed.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like this whole thing also kind of destroys a certain prosecution argument. Something I see online a lot is people say, okay, well, they're abused, why did they kill their mother as well? And then people will say, oh, they had to kill Kitty as well, because if they didn't kill her, then they wouldn't inherit. But as we've said previously, there's strong arguments which completely contradict money ever being a motive. So then, if money is not a motive, you have to go back to then again, why did they kill Kitty? And then the only other prosecution theory about this is what is basically said on the tape, which is the mercy killing theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when that's scrutinized, that theory also doesn't make any sense, because it's basically like, okay, well, she's miserable because she's being abused and controlled by Jose, so we have to put her out of her misery. But then if we kill Jose, we still need to put her out of her misery. And then I guess people would say, like, oh, it's because she couldn't live without Jose. But, like, I feel like psychologically that doesn't really make sense for Erik and Lyle to think that, right? I mean, It makes sense why they would agree to say that on this tape, right? Because I think, didn't they even say in their testimony that they agreed to do this because I think specifically Erik, Lyle, like, said it made Erik feel somewhat better that she would have wanted to been killed, right? So that's why they sort of signed on to that theory.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually psychologically analyze it, it doesn't actually make sense.
Yeah. I think that's why the idea that, like, Jose was the only abuser and, like, the only problem in the family, like, doesn't make sense. Because when people talk about this case, they often are, like, willing to accept that Jose was an abusive man, but then they always say, like, but what about their mom? Like, she didn't deserve it too. And it's like, right, so they didn't just kill their parents because their father was abusive. Like, it's right there. Like, It doesn't make sense that they would do that. So what if there's another theory or another motive behind it? And what if that motive is the one that the brothers said?
Yeah.
Yeah. But, yeah, I mean, I just think that, like, the way that Lyle talks about Jose on this tape, like, especially the one where he says, like,
I feel angry toward my relative. Why didn't you do something when you knew what was going on and I didn't? And now when I found out, I did something about it. I did what I thought my mother would want me to do, which is please kill me, and I can't, and I just couldn't just kill my mom, and that would be ridiculous. I wanted to get rid of the source, and I couldn't live with that. Nobody could.
Like, I think that whole section is just so indicative of the real issues behind, like, why they killed their parents. Especially the section where he says, like, when I found out, I did something about it.
Yeah.
Where it's, like, this whole idea that the killings were motivated by this thing that happened 3 years ago, like, that doesn't fit with what Lyle just said.
Mm-hmm. Because Oziel is an unethical therapist, doesn't really do his job properly. Oziel never really digs deeper, and he never, like, says, like, okay, but, like, what was the problem? What was the issue, right?
Mm-hmm. The other thing that kind of goes along with that is that Lyle says that killing his parents was an act of courage.
And for one moment before I went back to school, I had a chance, even though my life was going really well, and to show some courage, I felt, and help Erik and I, help my mother.
I think courage is a very strong word.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're using it in relation to having to have killed your parents. Why courage specific? Like, why was courage required? Courage is a very strong emotion. It's the kind of thing where it's like, if this was like some cold calculated plan, why would courage, like a great amount of courage, be required? But it is consistent with what the brothers testified to, right? That would require courage to do something in that situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, like, generally people think about courage as, like, facing something that scares you, right? So, like,
Mm-hmm.
that, to me, goes to this idea that, like, they were afraid of their parents. Showing some courage, like, standing up to someone who's been treating you horribly and treating your brother horribly for your whole life, like, that is courageous. I think some of this, like, leads into kind of an interesting discussion about, like, whether Lyle was only motivated by fear. Some of the way that Lyle talks on this tape, to me, makes me think that it wasn't entirely fear motivated, but, like, was also him rescuing his brother and, like, saving Erik.
I think there was a lot of anger as well. Which
Yeah.
It kind of shows.
I mean, I think it just speaks to, like, all of the complicated emotions that were going on that, like, are involved in killing your abuser. It could have been completely fear motivated, or it could have been also motivated by a desire to escape and a desire to rescue your brother from this horrible situation, like, and all of those things fit in with, like, the defense's theory.
Yeah. I feel like something else that goes towards that is what he says earlier in the tape as well. Earlier in that quote where he references, like, before I went back to school, I had a chance, like, even though my life was going really well at that point. I feel like when he said that, he's kind of referencing, like, his chance at basically rescuing Erik before he went back to college. And he says right there, like, my life was going really well at that point. I didn't have to, like, do this.
Yeah. Yeah, so right after Lyle says that killing his parents was him showing some courage, he says,
We got together, and it was the fact that we couldn't communicate together and sit down and face each other and talk about the real issues, that it was almost done looking in different directions. Just a little word here, a little word there, and a little word here. And this sort of thing you don't kill your parents based on a little word here, a little word there. It was obvious that we felt a tremendous amount of emotion, exactly the same emotion, and it just took a little word here and there, almost as if a third party was discussing. Mm-hmm. And it was just a meeting of the minds. The time is now. It's not a great time. I'm doing well. Get ready to go to UCLA. We're psyched about a lot of things, but we can't ignore the fact that my mother has to live with us.
To me, the way I interpret that is, like, very similar to how Lyle testified about, like, the last week of events before the parents were killed. Like, the whole little word here, little word there, like, they're looking for these cues and hints of what their parents are doing and feeling. And, like, you know, the brothers talked about a lot of little quips, little lines that they heard from their parents over that week that, like, increased their fear.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, then, like he says, you don't kill your parents based on a little word here and a little word there. It was obvious we felt a tremendous amount of emotion. So that to me speaks to, like, okay, yes, it had to do with them reading into these hints and clues from their parents, but they wouldn't have actually gone forward with it if there wasn't this massive crisis going on in the family and all of the emotions surrounding, like, this abuse secret.
Yeah, I agree with that. And what I think Lyle says earlier in the quote is really important as well, where he references, he says, and it was the fact that we couldn't communicate together and sit down and face each other and talk about the real issues. That, I feel like, also links in with the last week and how he tried talking with Kitty, he tried talking with Jose, and there was just no, like, they couldn't come to any sort of agreement. The parents were, like, it was their way or the highway, kind of, and they sort of took the silent treatment with Erik and Lyle during the last week as well. There was a lack of communication. There always was a lack of communication in the family, but especially in that last week. Like, something that Leslie says in her closing argument, which I think relates to this, is if the parents just at any point in this last week had just gave them any sort of reassurance or any words of affirmation, be like, no, everything's fine, this wouldn't have happened, basically. And I feel like that quote of Lyle's there does relate to that.
Yeah. And especially even the second half of that line, like, it was almost done looking in different directions. Like, I think the way that he phrases it is super interesting. Like, and then almost, it just took a little word here and there, almost as if a third party was discussing. What do you make of that?
I don't know, actually. I've thought about it for a while, but I'm not sure. The only thing that really came to my mind was the fact that Erik and Lyle's feelings were maybe a bit different. So, like, I think Lyle was motivated by, like, a desire to protect Erik and anger, whereas Erik was primarily fear motivated. I feel like Lyle felt quite separated from Erik in that way, because I think he even says in his testimony after the crime, I think he said that he just felt, like, uncomfortable around Erik, like, afterwards for some reason. Like, what they did was bad and he didn't want to, like, be near him at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in Lyle himself there's a lot of confusion surrounding this whole thing, and you sort of see that there. Yeah.
Because it's hard to tell if he's saying that, like, the brothers were looking in different directions, or, like, the parents and the brothers were looking in different directions. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be that as well.
I think kind of the main thing that I got from those two lines is, like, there's this huge disconnect between the brothers and their parents about, like, how to go about handling this huge issue in the family. And, like he says in that first line, like, just the lack of communication in the family was, like, a major component of why this ended up happening. I wanted to talk a bit about, like, the theory that Lyle was using mother as a metaphor for brother. Because, like, a lot of the quotes that are references to things, like, Lyle is talking about things and then he talks about them as if they're things that happened to Kitty.
Now, did you, in looking over this transcript, form the opinion that there were times when Lyle Menendez is using the word mother as a metaphor for brother?
Yes, there were. There is statements that are made that are dated, and then there are vague statements that are made that need to be followed up on, and that when it continues between pages 16 and 17, it really needs to be clarified. There's just too much that's not clear that would require some more exploration.
I'm curious what you think about, like, the idea that a lot of the times that Lyle is talking about, like, things that happened to Kitty, he's actually, like, using a metaphor for how they felt or how Erik felt.
I think that probably is true for certain parts. I feel like there's parts where he's talking about Kitty, and then when he starts talking about like that there was no escape, no way out, kind of, then he's sort of starting to use it as a metaphor for mother for brother. I feel like there's other parts as well where he's talking about Kitty and like her issues, but then maybe in his own mind, like he's sort of talking about Eric's situation as well.
Yeah, well, like this one where he says, "These are the reasons my father should be killed. There's no question. What he's doing is impossible to live with for myself based on what he's doing to my mother."
Did you consider this statement by Lyle Menendez, based on what he's doing to my mother, a potential metaphor?
Yes, I did.
And a metaphor for what?
Metaphor for brother.
I feel like that makes sense as well, because I think at that point he's thinking about the fact that when he learned about like actually what Jose was doing to Erik, there was no way that he could like let Jose live.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that line makes sense if he's actually talking about Kitty, because like what Jose did to Kitty happened 3 years before, and like Lyle knew that she was suicidal like 3 years before, so how is it that now it's impossible for him to live with this when like he's known about it for 3 years?
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up when we mentioned the courage thing as well, because that comes up later as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. When they talk about the boating trip.
We had a boating trip right before the incident, and it had nothing to do with the main problem, which required a lot of courage.
I feel like Lyle mentions it here generally because in his mind it's so connected to that last week. I mean, it was the day before, right? So, and they would have been afraid on that boat, which I feel like the boat captain's testimony is pretty evident of that. In Erik Tells All, Erik says that when they were on that boat and they were like sitting up at the front, right? Basically, like Lyle was apologizing to him and saying like, "I'm sorry, like I didn't do anything before," and then Erik was saying, "No, like it's not your fault. Don't worry," basically. So I feel like that boat trip was very important for them, and is linked very much to the crime.
Mm-hmm. I think in Lyle's mind, like this boating trip is more connected to their fear. But then that's why then he says like it had nothing to do with the main problem, which required a lot of courage, because in his head, like he also killed his father to eliminate the problem of him sexually abusing his brother, and that was the action that required courage. That's kind of how I interpret that quote.
Mm-hmm. Right, I think I agree with you on that.
It is super interesting that he brings up so many things of like events of that last week, though.
I feel like it shows just how important the last week was, which is kind of what the crux of their defense was.
Mm-hmm.
We could sort of relate that back to our episode with Dr. Burgess as well. That's something that Dr. Burgess said when we interviewed her. That she was like, that last week was so important.
Yeah. Another key reference to the events of the last week is Lyle says at one point,
I didn't think about it for a long time until Erik and I would get together and we would share what was happening in the family. And
which I don't think that really fits at all with any of the other issues that they talked about. Like, they never talked about possibly, like, sharing that Jose had an affair.
Yeah.
Like, if that was the only thing happening in the family, like, then that line doesn't really make sense.
It also is the sort of thing where it's like, if it was just relating to, like, Kitty's suicidality or her depression, Lyle would have just said, like, yeah, we got together and talked about our mum's issues, right? But he doesn't say that. He talks about generally, like, the issues in the family. To me, that's definitely, like, referencing sexual abuse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it makes sense with, like, anything else.
Yeah.
And it lines up, like, perfectly with what the brothers said happened that led to them killing their parents. Like, it was Erik telling Lyle that Jose was still molesting him, and then them threatening to expose that to the world.
Yeah, like whenever they talk about the killings, it's always about Lyle's always referencing that there was an issue in the family that him and Erik got together and spoke about. But the issue is clearly not Kitty and her and like all her problems, right? Because whenever he brings up Kitty in this tape, he directly references her and her suicidality and her problems. But I mean, it's partly Oziel's fault as well, because Oziel never asks him, like, okay, well, what was the issue in the family that you and Erik had to get together and talk about?
Yeah.
And I think it's pretty obvious to anyone who's watched the trial that the issue was Erik being sexually abused by Jose.
The last thing that I think is important about, like, comparing what the brothers say on the tape to their testimony is that there's a quote where Oziel says, well, they're talking about how Lyle wishes that he was really close with Erik. And then Oziel says,
I remember how hurt you were when Erik told me what happened. And I remember the hurt, the pain. That he didn't talk with you about it first. You felt really violated. And that was real painful for you.
which is way more consistent with how the brothers describe when Lyle first found out that Erik had confessed to Oziel. Oziel doesn't say, like, Lyle was angry or aggressive. He says that he was hurt and violated.
Mm-hmm. No, he also doesn't say, I remember how you were angry and you were threatening towards me.
Mm-hmm.
Which you'd think he wouldn't have a problem saying, because he's, like, joking with the brothers at other parts in this tape and basically telling them that he doesn't care about them or their feelings.
Yeah.
But yeah, what he says there is more consistent with what the brothers testified to.
Part of what makes this tape so frustrating to listen to is that there's all of these things that the brothers, specifically Lyle, like, makes a lot of references to, but it's, like, just vague enough that it doesn't inherently mean anything. But then when you listen to it with the context of what they testified to, it, like, all lines up.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And it, like, it doesn't all line up with any other potential theory about this case.
Yeah. It kind of relates to how I feel generally about this case. I always say that the way I have evaluated evidence in this case is that I can look at every single piece of evidence in this case and look at it from a prosecution point of view and a defense point of view. And for every single bit of evidence, the defense has a decent to good answer for. But I cannot say the same for the prosecution. There are certain things, pieces of evidence in this trial where I think if you're looking at it from a prosecution point of view, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. None of the prosecution arguments, like, fit in with these lines. That's why I think it's so stupid that they were convicted based on this tape.
Yeah, I know. That still annoys me.
In the second trial, I don't think that the prosecution even... Did they argue that the theory on this tape was true?
More so focusing in on, like Lyle's comments about, having Erik wait on it, sleep on it for like a couple days, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I did want to talk about that.
There was no way I was going to make a decision to kill my mother without Erik's consent. I didn't even want to influence him in that issue. I just let him sleep on it in a couple days. Because I'm in a very good position to influence Erik on a lot of things. Because he knows that I care and a whole number of issues, and I can talk eloquently and whatever. And but when it came to that issue, I wanted nothing to do with it. It had to be his own personal issue. If he felt the same way I did about killing Mom.
Yeah, that's the one that it always comes up.
I can understand why people would take that and say, okay, this is premeditated. I mean, I have a different interpretation of it. My interpretation of this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, like, that I think Lyle's motivations for killing their parents was quite complicated. I think that this kind of shows that he had thought about killing their parents a few days before they were killed. And that would have been when he realized that his father was not going to stop sexually abusing his brother, and that his mother knew about it and wouldn't do anything to stop it.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's totally understandable that Lyle would have been like, okay, well, they might kill us and I need to defend myself, but also, like, I need to kill these people.
I think it makes sense as well, because in the timeline, that would have been, wasn't it when, like, Erik found out that Kitty knew, right, when he was going through the den, and then he ran to the guest house where Lyle was, right, and then Kitty followed them, and they had that big argument, right?
Yeah.
So then I can see, yeah, after that, emotions are going to be extremely high at that point. But then also I had like a slightly different take on it, which is that he could have also been thinking just strictly about the actually like wanting to defend themselves, because wasn't it Erik who was like very complacent and was like, I think Lyle spoke about this, is that he, like, Erik was basically like giving up and didn't really want to do anything. So I kind of see it like fitting into that, in that he sort of, Lyle was very much like pushing the we have to defend ourselves, and sort of like letting Erik be a bit more complacent. Do you see where I'm going with it?
I see what you're saying. But Lyle was the one in the whole week who was like kind of motivating the steps that they took to defend themselves, and like initiating, you know, oh, we should do this to figure out like if they're actually gonna kill us, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because even from their story, right? Yeah, Erik sort of like started the entire thing when he told Lyle what was happening, and then he wanted Lyle to basically speak with Jose so that he could like get him out of there, basically. But then post that, it's very much like Lyle controlling things and being like, and like taking steps and actions and basically being like, okay, we have to do this. We have to go get guns. We have to like take these steps to actually defend ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that often gets brought up by prosecution people from this tape is that Lyle says,
because even the planning out of this, the reason it took such a short period of time to figure it out was, one, because it could have happened at any moment. All the thinking beforehand was done, really.
This one I think is like the most obvious, just pulling what he said out of context, because like the prosecution loved to talk about how he said that they planned it out. But then like right away he says it could have happened at any moment.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I feel like that completely recontextualizes what he says.
If you're planning something like murder, it can't happen at any moment. Like, it has to be, you know, perfect for you to be able to get away with it.
Exactly. But then it is also consistent with what the brothers say happened, which is that they were paranoid that they could have been killed at any moment.
Yeah.
I feel like it's pretty important, right? Because you can sort of take out bits of the tape like that and say, hey, like, this shows it was, like, premeditated and et cetera, right? But then I feel like to accept that, you then have to ignore huge parts of the rest of the tape.
That particular interchange there, when he uses the word planning, do you think that is consistent with your theory that this was a crime done out of fear?
Well, planning of self-defense would be consistent with this. But again, if you take one line out of this entire, what I've already said, I think is an unreliable document, and why it is unreliable, you know, I cannot necessarily reconcile every line. But if you look across this with what is described, I don't think reconciling it is that difficult.
You don't think reconciling it is that difficult?
That's what I said.
Like, yeah, you could say that's, like, proof that they premeditated it, but then there's also this quote that Lyle says, he's talking about Kitty, and then he says, it was only after that ceased to be an answer, ceased to be a way out, that it was then a dangerous situation where Erik and I realized the go-ahead was given to kill us. Kill me before you leave, and basically leave our lives and go your separate ways. So, like, him calling it a dangerous situation is much more, like, about the fear, and the very in line with self-defense over, like, premeditation.
Mm-hmm. Especially, like, the, just before he says it was a dangerous situation, like, cease to be a way out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they were, as if they were, like, trapped. Like, there was no way out. I think he makes reference to that at another point, like, there was no way out, right?
Yeah. The main other thing that prosecution people love to talk about is the dog analogy.
Oh.
I think one of the biggest pains you have is that you miss just having these people around. I miss not having my dog around, if I can make such a gross analogy. Mm-hmm. That, you know, whether I hated the thing when it was around now and I've given it away, now that it's gone, I miss all the things that we...
And then he kind of cuts off.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably not the nicest analogy to make, but I feel like what he says there afterwards, after that, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think it also makes sense in the context that, like, I think they talked about this in the trial, that the family had, like, aggressive dogs, and that they had to have one of them sent away, right?
Oh, yes, I remember that. They had a dog when he was really young, and then he had a friend come over to the house, and the dog attacked the friend, and because of that, I think they had to give the dog away to someone else, and then eventually it was put down.
So, if you're comparing your parents to your dog that you hated, who was so aggressive that you had to give it away, like, what does that say about your parents? I don't know.
I saw it more as, like, him feeling like a lack of, like, actual familial, like, connection. Like, yeah, she's your mum, but she's this woman who has told you, like, every single day of your life that she hates you and wishes you were never born. There's a lack of a bond there and, like, a disconnection. And so I think him sort of comparing her to, like, his dog is him sort of disconnecting from her, like, not, like, trying to other her in a way. Do you kind of get where I'm going with that?
Mm-hmm.
Did you consider that at all psychologically significant, that he would liken his parents to a dog?
Yes.
And what did you think of that?
Well, I thought it was, as he says, a gross analogy. I thought it was tragic that in trying to talk about missing someone, what he calls forth is a relationship with a pet. I suppose he could have talked about one of the stuffed animals there, instead of talking about some real human being, some relative or some girlfriend or someone real in his life.
Okay, so rather than showing a cold and callous nature, you'd have decided that this shows the fact that he is in fact abused. Is that correct? That he was abused by his parents?
No, I don't think that this proves that he was abused, but I think that this analogy, which is stupid and horrible, doesn't prove that he was abused, but it talks about his life, and it's consistent with the way he talked about his life as essentially not having any other human being there for him. And so the model of what it's like to miss something isn't a model of missing a human being, it's missing a pet.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic that he's, like, dehumanized these people who are supposed to be, like, the most important people in his life.
Yeah, but I feel like that speaks to the way he was raised and the parenting skills of his parents.
Yeah.
So I think one thing that always sort of comes back to me about this tape is, or something that I always say about this tape is, I don't know how you can listen to, like, just take Lyle out of this tape and what he says on this tape. I don't understand how anyone can listen to this tape and listen to Erik on it and come away thinking that he had cold-bloodedly premeditated the murders of his parents. Just from what he says on the tape to his demeanor on the tape, the way he talks about what he's talking about, all of it is just so inconsistent with someone who would just, like, callously plan to murder their parents for any, like, superfluous reason.
Yeah. I mean, basically the whole second half of the tape, he's just crying, and, like, crying so loudly that you can hear it on the tape.
Yeah, the way I describe it is, do you know when someone is crying, but it's the type of cry where it's like physically painful to listen to it?
Yeah.
Do you kind of get what I'm saying? It makes you feel so uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's just very obvious that he's, like, in a lot of emotional pain with what he's done, essentially. Like, you know, especially like when he's expressing like some deep regret and remorse for what he did, like, and crying quite heavily about the fact that he had killed his parents.
They were very apparent in my mind before this and led up to the fact where I had no choice. I would have taken any other choice. Because I look back on it and realizing when people are working so I much regret it. I may not have had a choice at the time, but I regret it now. He was somebody that I loved and almost had no choice to do what I did. And I hate myself for doing it. And I understand why it was done when somehow my camera has to like because because of the love that I have for my mother.
It's a little bit hard to believe that someone who is clearly so incredibly distressed and saying that they love their mum would kill her for like the most callous reason, which is basically like just to put her out of her misery and because you wanted her money. Like, I don't know, it's another part where I'm like, it's not, to me it's not psychologically consistent.
I mean, I agree with you. I don't understand how you can listen to how he sounds on this tape and think that, like, he's a cold-blooded murderer. I mean, especially because he says, like, multiple times that he had no choice but to kill his parents.
Yeah. I mean, and not only does he say, I had no choice, but he also says, I would have taken any other choice.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty important. In what scenario would you feel like you had no choice but to kill your parents? But not only that, in your own head, there was no other, like you would have taken any other choice if those options were available to you. You would have, but you felt in that moment that you had no choice.
Now, do you consider it significant that in a therapy session where a patient has said or agreed that a mother was killed in some form of mercy killing, if one of those patients then says this killing was because he had no choice, would you consider that a significant thing to follow up on?
Yes, I would.
Is having no choice consistent with a mercy killing?
No, it is not.
It's consistent with the brother's testimony, but it's not consistent with any of the prosecution's theories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then he basically just is crying throughout this entire spiel, I guess. I don't really know what else to call it. Like, he's just sort of, it's just all coming out of him. Like, sort of as if he can't control what he's saying. I feel like he gets very close to revealing things that they probably have said beforehand that they wouldn't reveal.
It was something that was beyond control. And
What was beyond control? Did you have to tell me?
eventually it had to happen. It was basically ruining my life and I guess lives.
Right, like, it wasn't that it was ruining Kitty's life, it was ruining his life.
Yeah. But again, that's another point during the tape where it's like, why Oziel just doesn't follow up on that. He doesn't ask him, wait, what exactly? Can we clarify on that? What was basically ruining your life?
Mm-hmm. Well, the, like, beyond control and it had to happen is also, like, same with, like, I had no choice. Like, not premeditating, planning out a murder, like, kind of killing. It's out of desperation and out of intense emotion and fear.
Yeah, it's a good point. When Erik says, and it was something that was beyond control, and that doesn't sound like a premeditated murder to me. It's more consistent with heat of passion.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a point where Erik says, like, it doesn't matter what they were or something like that? Does that sound...
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar? I feel like there was a point where Erik is basically referencing the fact that his parents were abusive or basically awful people, but he doesn't care.
Oh, yeah, it's right in the beginning. First of all, this whole section of Erik speaking starts because Oziel has gone on this long rant about how Jose was controlling the brothers and controlling Kitty and just ruthless. And then he asks Erik what he thinks about this. And Erik says, I just don't like hearing it. And he says that multiple times. And then he says, my father and mother were two people that I loved, and I just don't like hearing it. It doesn't matter what they were.
Yeah, that, exactly. Like, that's very specific, saying it doesn't matter what they were. I feel like because he has such conflicting feelings, right? He's trying to justify to himself why he should love his parents. It doesn't matter what they were. Like, yeah, they may have been abusive and they may have been this or that, but it doesn't sort of change how he feels.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it definitely suggests that, like, they were doing something that would make him not love them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just this whole section, to me, it really shows someone who has, like, a appreciation for life, and, I mean, he says it himself, how he recognizes that, like, what people are worth and so on. And it's like, okay, well, if you feel this way and this is the type of person you are, what was it that pushed you to kill two people?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this section really shows that Erik was not the type of person to do this for a stupid reason.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like, I think the mercy killing is a stupid theory.
Yeah, referencing the closing argument, Leslie's closing argument again, one last time, there's actually a point in it when she says, like, she looks at Erik and she's like, to quote my client, surely they don't believe that she was killed, basically for a mercy killing, basically. I thought that was very interesting that she actually said that.
Yeah. Well, then there's Oziel says,
Did you ever try to tell your mom or talk to your mom about what your dad was doing?
No, I couldn't face that. I left that up to my brother. I couldn't face that.
Do you know when you listen to that on the tape as well, the way Erik says that, you can tell he was sort of taken aback at first when he says, no, I couldn't face that.
mm-hmm.
Because I think it brought up some memories for him.
Yeah. I mean, even though, like, I don't think Oziel was actually asking him about, like, the sexual abuse, I think Oziel was asking about, like, what Jose was doing to Kitty. But then the way that Erik responds is like, oh, no, I couldn't face that. Like, oh, I couldn't face talking to my mom about what my dad was doing to me.
Mm-hmm. That's how I saw it as well.
A few times in this section, Erik refers to, like, loving his parents and loving his father. But one of the times he says, I love my father and I'll never love anyone like that. Which I think is really interesting if you think about, like, the truth of this case. Like, for him to say that he would never love anyone how he loves his father who's been raping him for 12 years. To me, it brings to mind how, like, incestuous sexual abuse victims often have, like, very complicated and conflicting feelings around, like, their parent being the abuser, that, like, is what they're doing to me a form of love, and, like, equating being abused with being loved because that's the only time that they, like, feel affection from their abuser. And especially in this case, like, that was something that Erik testified about, how the times when he was a child, when he first began to be sexually abused by Jose, like, he equated it with love because that was the only time that Jose was, like, nice to him.
Mm-hmm. I hadn't thought of that before, actually, but it's a really, really good point. I think it also speaks to, like, the trauma bond as well that can form in these sorts of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Even to this day, I think. Like, when you hear Erik speak about Jose now, even as like a man in his 50s, he still sounds like as if like he's so connected yet afraid of this man, and there's so many complex emotions, but this man had such an impact on him that it still affects him even to this day. And the guy's been dead for over 30 years at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this whole section where he's talking about, like, loving his parents, just, like, repeating that multiple times, like, you know, by either theory of this case, like, the idea that Erik would have so much love for his parents is really, like, a difficult thing to wrestle with, you know? Like, even if you think that they weren't abusive, I think that most people think that they would kill out of hatred, or like that you couldn't kill someone if you loved them, you know. But then for Erik to be like repeating this over and over again, like, and kind of going back and forth of like saying that Jose was ruining him and ruining his life, and then going back to, well, he loves me, or Kitty loves, or like my mom loves me, things like that. Like,
yeah, I get what you mean.
It's a very interesting part of this case to me. He also talks about this dream that he has of committing suicide.
Okay. From a dream where I had was trying to convince two of my friends to shoot me. And they wouldn't do it. No matter how I would try to convince them, so I took the gun that was in my hand and shot myself several times in the heart, and then I died. And there was a moment where it was just an immense pleasure. I was happy, and there was no tension on my mind, there was no stress, and everything was calm, and everything was great. And then I woke up in the morning and I was upset that I was alive because of the great feeling that I had when I was no longer alive.
What kind of feeling?
There was feeling there was no oppression, and there was no more sadness to be had. And you no longer had to feel sad about your parents.
That does not sound like someone who would plan out the murder of your parents because you just hate these people and you don't care about them. Plus, like, you know, this kind of goes to Oziel, like, never follows up on the fact that Erik is suicidal and has this very intense description of feeling happy that he had killed himself in his dream and feeling upset that it wasn't reality. And, like, Oziel never actually addresses that Erik is suicidal, which is the whole reason that Erik came to speak to him to begin with. My general takeaway from Erik on this tape is, like, he's just clearly mentally not in a very good place. He, like, what he's saying sometimes just, like, doesn't logically make sense. And he's, like, crying all the time. And I think it just speaks to, like, what Dr. Vickery, who, like, saw him in jail, like, his psychiatrist when he was in jail, like, said that he was having, like, a psychotic break when he first spoke to him. So, and, like, you can totally hear on this tape how, like, not mentally well Erik is.
Yeah, very psychologically, like, screwed up. But then I feel like that speaks more to the type of person that he is and why it's sort of inconsistent with, like, a cold, calculated plan to murder your parents for whatever reason.
I think it shows that he was incredibly affected by what he did to his parents. And in both trials, the prosecution tried to make the brothers out to be these stone-cold, callous people who, you know, planned out the murder of their parents and because they hated them and they had no emotion towards these people. But I think that Erik's behavior on the tape is just completely contrary to that.
Yeah, I think you've summed that up well. So I think it's important to sort of recognize the way in which this tape was presented in each trial and how that may have affected how each jury viewed it. How was it presented in trial number 1? Wasn't it? Because it wasn't permitted at first, right?
Right. At first, the tape wasn't allowed to be played. And then after the brothers testified, and after all of the defense witnesses testified, and after Oziel had testified, the tape was played. So, the jury had complete context for everything that was said on the tape. And I think that made it, way clearer to that first jury, that this tape was not a smoking gun, proof that they premeditated this. And then also the defense presented, therapeutic experts to evaluate the tape, like Dr. Burgess and Dr. Conti, so that the jurors could understand, how these references that the brothers were making were, not inconsistent with their testimony.
Yeah. It's very different to how the tape was presented in the second trial. So essentially, the prosecution got to play the tape in their case in chief very early on. There was no expert analysis around the tape, and since Oziel was never called to testify, that jury never really got to see his behavior and see him be cross-examined on certain actions he took and what he said about how the sessions took place. And Lyle did not testify either. So that jury just in general was, in my opinion, were lacking a lot of context.
Yeah.
I am still of the opinion, though, that even without some of that context, I think those jury members had a very rudimentary and basic understanding of the tape. I can't really imagine a world in which they truly analyze that tape correctly, because I think anyone with basic reading comprehension and a bit of thought and critical analysis skills could see that there's a lot more to the tape than one or two quotes taken from it.
Yeah. The main juror from the second trial, Andrew Wolfgang, he speaks out a lot, and he loves to say people don't know what it was like. Now they want to come in and say that we got it wrong, but they weren't there or whatever. And yeah, but also there's too many things said on this tape that don't make sense with premeditation that I agree with you. I think if they actually had analyzed it, even without all of the context that the jury in the first trial had, that they could have come to the same conclusion.
Andrew Wolfgang in the latest documentary, you could tell he's kind of annoyed because he's oh, it's kind of Monday morning quarterbacking for people to sit there and basically say that we got it wrong or whatever, right? But I'm
yeah.
I mean, I can understand his feelings on some level, but at the same time, there are reasons why people feel the way they do about your verdict.
Right.
I'm sure those jurors, I don't necessarily blame them for the verdict because they saw a very, very different trial. But I also think it's fine and it's completely fair for people to maybe criticize the verdicts and maybe how they came to those verdicts.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would have been much harder for them to bring a verdict of manslaughter, but I don't think it was impossible.
That reminded me of Leslie said in an interview after the second trial that apparently their defense team they knew they didn't do very well, but they thought the verdicts were going to be second degree murder and not first degree.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that shows even though she knew that they got screwed over with the way that they were allowed to present evidence and that so much was restricted, she still thought they made a case. Considering how much those jurors took this tape into account, I think that played a huge role in, like, honestly, I think in affecting, like, how they viewed the trial, because the prosecution played it, like, one of the first pieces of evidence that they introduced. But, I mean, that being said, I think they should have been allowed experts to analyze it. I think they should have been allowed to present, like, the defense should have been allowed to present all the evidence that they did in the first trial, and, like, maybe that would have influenced how the jury saw this tape.
Yeah. I mean, I also think the tape just shouldn't have come in the first place.
Yeah, that too.
To me, it's a conversation between a therapist and his two patients. To me, that's the end of it. Like, that at that point, it shouldn't even be, like, I don't know why it was allowed as evidence. And I know, like, there was some stupid argument about how, oh, the brothers put their mental states on trial, so the tape was allowed to come in because of that. But I think it's ridiculous. I'd say my overall conclusion when it comes to this tape is that it is probably one of the most interesting pieces of evidence in this trial. It is also one of the most misconstrued pieces of evidence in this trial. No one who hasn't seen the trial seems to know what this actually is. In my opinion, I think if you come into this tape having heard the brother's testimony and seen the first trial in its entirety, and you actually analyze the tape, I think you'll come away believing the brothers, basically, or feeling that there's just more things on this tape that aren't answered by the prosecution, but they are answered by the defense.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. Like, when I listened to this tape, I felt like it solidified my, like, belief that the brothers were telling the truth, and I was able to do that because I had all the context for the statements that they made, and everything lined up with the defense theory. It really bothers me that this tape is used to say that the brothers are guilty, because if you really look at it, like, I don't think there's any way that you can actually really analyze this tape like we did and get that conclusion from it. And I hope that, like, our analysis kind of helped to set the record straight about this, because every time I hear in the media about this being, like, the tape where the brothers confessed to killing their parents, or, like, they murdered their parents and they told their therapist about it on this tape, it's like, no.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily what the tape is about exactly. Like, the tape is about a lot more than that.
Yeah. Considering it took us, like, a super long time to go over everything that was said on this tape and to really understand, like, everything from it, like, I think that should show that it's not as simple as it's made out to be in documentaries and things.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. We have a few more episodes to go to complete our series on the Menendez case, but we also both have busy lives, so we appreciate your patience and your continued support and comments.